And now we'll go to the INOVA process report.
Yes, Matt Smith is going to do this, but I also would like to call Vicki Draper up to the microphone. Vicki is the principal, as you all know, at Cypress Elementary School. We are going to have Matt do an overview, and then Vicki's going to talk about how it impacts the campus specifically. And you may ask, well, why was Vicki picked? She was picked because she did such an outstanding job when we went to her campus of explaining how her campus was implementing the INOVA process. And so in line of the reasoning that when you do a great job, you get more work, Vicki is here tonight, but we do want to thank you for being here. We know you have to get to school early in the morning, so thank you for doing this for us. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Smith.
I think I heard Dan say, they don't want to hear you talk, they want to hear Vicki talk, so I'll move quick. The INOVA process, we're going to talk a little bit about what is INOVA. INOVA is a statistical analysis of our STAR data, as you all know. It's focused on a value-added approach, meaning taking a look at how our students perform and if given intervention and support, how we could expect them to perform. It is provided in an easy-to-access way to read, so imagine a very comprehensive look at how students perform on STAR in a one-page document that is a profile of a student that a principal could see or a teacher could see. And we compare our students to similar students in LISD. So based on our student groups with 38,000 students, or however many students we have testing, we take the students and take a look at their profiles. This process helps us narrow that down some and start to categorize our students so we can best make decisions for intervention and support for our students. The foundations of INOVA, what Dr. Ramirez talked to us about when he came in and worked with us, is really moving from just a pass-fail mentality, even if, so either students pass or they fail, and then we wait and see what happens next year. But that idea of a value-added approach, meaning how did the students do, how do we predict them to do the next year, and how will they do if we provide them the right and targeted interventions in the meantime. One of the key pieces that he notes is that not all students need academic interventions. I think that's one of those things that we've thought about in education for a long time is if a student doesn't do well on one of these tests, we're just going to give them more academic intervention. But the key thing in all of this is looking at the student and their profile and actually seeing, okay, given all factors, were there other things that we should be considering about the student? Do they need mentors? Do they need other support, some kind of psychosocial support, instead of just an academic intervention? And then the last thing is really taking a look at our interventions that we have in place and that we have used, and being able to use this data process to analyze how those interventions are working throughout our system. For example, I think many districts across the nation have added and added and added and added support programs for a long time, and you get many, many, many interventions that you can choose from. And then the question always comes up, how do we know what intervention works for what students? And the INOVA process helps us to do that. Basically what this process does is they start to categorize our students based on their likelihood of passing the STAR. So based on that student's test performance, what is the likelihood they will pass the STAR exam coming up? And those are categorized into those color categories above, and I'm sure Vicki will talk to you a little bit about that coming up and how they use the categories. And then we can put them on a bell curve and take a look and say, okay, is this student a tail left? What that means is tail left is that the student actually performed at a level that they started in, it'd be predicted that they outperformed where they were. So we needed to, excuse me, they underperformed. Sorry, I got flustered for a second. They underperformed where we would predict them to be. So they have not performed up to the level that we would have predicted. Therefore, given an intervention, we can expect that they would move forward in a
and that's performance to expected level, not necessarily performance to the arbitrary passing or failing expectation.
You're absolutely right, correct.
And what's critical about that is a critical concept, because you have, and I've been asked many times by parents, well, my child's going to pass this test anyhow, why should they take the test? And the question really is an important one to be able to answer, and the answer is we want to see whether they're making appropriate progress. And so one of the things that happens through the INOVA process is if a child, and think about it this way, and I apologize, Matt, but I get pretty passionate about this topic. If a child comes into school and it takes $10 worth of knowledge to pass a test, They come in with $20 worth of knowledge because they have a really enriched home life. And then next year they get $19 worth of knowledge because they keep progressing, and then $18, and $17, and $16. Under the typical system, you say, well, that child's passing, they're doing great. What I want to see is them go from 20 to 21 to 22 to the very maximum that they can get. So even the students who will end up going to some of the most elite colleges and universities need to take the test to determine, are they scoring what they should be scoring from year to year? That's very important to look at progress over time. It's a growth model rather than just simply that they pass. Because again, a student could come in and move into our district with $6 worth of knowledge, right? Or start in kindergarten with $6 worth of knowledge, and we get them to 7, 8, 9, and in third grade, they show up as a failure and actually didn't pass the test. And they're labeled as a failure by the state system, when indeed they progressed and were actually successful. And if we continue on the trajectory, they're going to be a passer, and maybe by high school, extremely successful. So the pass-fail model, Dr. Ramirez believes, and I believe as well, is just blatantly a false methodology for evaluating whether kids are really progressing.
I was just going to add that that growth model you just described is completely aligned with one of our board goals, right, which is all oriented around that student progress, right?
To clarify though, we are using the STAR test, but it's not necessarily the only one you could use. This is a model, correct, that could help. We could use this in many ways to look at growth of the student, because I guess what I'm saying is the way, if somebody just looked at the first 2 pages, they'd be like, oh great, they've got this model to help people pass STAR. And that's not it at all.
Not at all.
This is about taking a student's learning and increasing their learning. We could use a number of factors, but this is the one we're using because it's currently, I
And
think,
eventually
the one
we
we
will
have.
use other factors. One of the things that David Ramirez is able to do through his analysis is to allow you to use benchmark and checkpoints into the system as well. Not related sometimes even to the STAR test, because it could be a grade level that isn't testing. But I'm getting us off topic and I want to get us back. So Matt,
You know, I'll keep you off topic just for a second. One of the things that we've been working on over the past year and a half, and before we started using INOVA, is the predictability of those benchmark assessments that we have in our system, and how will our students perform on state assessments that given a certain performance on our benchmark. So we've been playing with that and working on that as a system, and also marrying that with the INOVA process. Going back to your question, is it only STAR that we look at? And I think what you'll hear from Vicki is that the answer is definitely no. We use this, but we also triangulate it with other data that we have in our system, just to make sure that we're appropriately supporting every student. Centered students on the bell curve perform as we would expect them to have performed. So given no intervention, we can kind of predict that they will perform right on target with what they've performed in the past. And then finally, maybe, there we go, our students that have underperformed, I'm saying this backwards again, aren't I? Overperformed, it's a long night. Overperformed on the exam. And what we want to do with those students is, if you think about that, if they've overperformed 1 year before, then we need to continue to keep them at a certain level in order to expect them to perform at that level again. So we have to have some kind of intervention or support model for them in order to keep them at that performance. As Dan mentioned earlier, you know, the idea is not just to pass the test, the idea is to help each and every student grow in our system. And by talking about that, if they've overperformed 1 year, we really need to think about supporting those students just as much as the other students throughout that we've talked about previously, because they need that support to continue performing at the high level.
That's what'll increase our national merit scholar numbers.
Correct. And so without further ado, we're going to talk about INOVA in action at Cypress Elementary School.
Just couldn't get there fast enough.
Just couldn't.
Okay, I don't know how to operate this thing. Is it here? Okay. Okay, so what did we do? That didn't get me to where we were supposed to go.
That's the next page.
Nope.
Are we missing the Cypress Elementary slides?
That's what we have.
Is this what was in the original board book, not the?
These should have been uploaded today. I think Vicki sent them today, and they should have been uploaded. So
I think they were board extras.
Yeah.
the board extras. Okay. If you take a look at the board extras, we'll be able to walk you through that real quickly. Let me see if I can pull those up for you. Apologize about that. Here you go, Vicki. Okay.
Do all board members have that now? We'll try to pull it off while you're getting that. Go ahead.
So, if you're looking at the first page, what you should see on the left-hand side is the INOVA sheet that we get on each student. And what we did when we received those back in, I believe it was January, late January, what we did was, at Cypress, we took that data and we infused it with other data that we had on each student. So we looked at attendance for our students, we looked at EcoDisc for our students, we looked at if they were already in RTI, if they were in special education, if they were in our Quest program, what did we already know about that student as a whole? We looked at their benchmark data, where they had been performing, so that we could look at them globally versus a one-shot day of how they had performed. So we took that information, these were our 4th and 5th graders, because those are the students that we got our data on, and we took a particular group of our students and put them on a huge board in my office, and then took those students and kind of color-coded them in those different ways so that we could kind of group them in a way that we could see where they fit into multiple categories. So did they fall as an attendance concern and they were an RTI student, or were they attendance concern and they were a special education student or a Quest student, or what was it, so that we could kind of get a big picture of that student. Then we, thank you. Then we, I brought in each individual teacher for those students, and I had a conversation with those teachers about each individual student, and just took notes about how that student was performing in the classroom. What did their performance look like academically? What did they look like emotionally? What did they look like socially in that classroom? In other words, paint a picture for me of what that student looks like. Where are they currently at? With that information, we then took that information to select the driver that was holding that student back. What was the one thing that was standing in the way the most for that particular student? As Matt had mentioned, one of the things that we've learned is it's not just about that academic intervention. What we had been doing was just giving more academic, more academic, more academic. What we were learning about these students is there were other things standing in their way. So what we identified for many of this group of students that we had on my board were that they needed either mentors, or they needed counseling support, or they needed some type of intervention along those lines. They had test anxiety, they had attendance concerns, they had different things like that that we needed to address in a completely different way. Not that we didn't need to continue to give them academic intervention, because we did, but we also needed to give them some other form of intervention as well. So we identified what those drivers were, and then started to give that intervention along with the academic intervention. So we gave them 2 different types of intervention along the way. So we wrote that intervention plan for each one of those students. Teachers went back, along with those interventions, many of those intervention plans went with the teachers to go back and discuss things with the students, which was a different type of intervention than they maybe had done before. Usually the teacher was writing that plan without the student as part of that intervention. This time they were going back and talking to the student about that intervention and having the student be a part of that intervention plan, and I think that really opened up the door for that student a whole lot more to be a part of that decision-making process. So we think that made a big difference for them as well. Then the teachers started those interventions with the students. We did that for about 4 weeks. Teachers came back, we had another conversation, they updated, gave me some feedback as to how things were going with the student, made adjustments as we needed for the plan, tweaked things as we needed, made adjustments as we needed for testing, for mentoring, for counseling, whatever it was that we needed to do differently for that child, and tweaked it. Did teacher-student conferences, determined different testing needs, etc., and then made adjustments to that plan as we went. So then let's take a look at what our data results were. So the group that I was talking about that was on my board, it was actually a group of targeted students that we looked at. It was that group of students that were the tail left students that we were talking about earlier, the underperforming students. They were, our primary response for them should have been psychosocial and mentoring, which is what I had talked about. Secondary response was instructional intervention, so those were the two areas that we focused on. For our 5th grade math students, there were 6 of them that we were targeting. 5 of the 6 in this first round, passed the test. There were 2 in the previous year, only 2 out of those 6 had passed previously. So we had several students that had not passed before. All of them significantly scored better than they had scored previously. So 83% passing rate for this first round in our math, our 5th grade math. So
I have a question that gets closest, which is, but it's probably more for Dr. Troxel or Matt. We opened up this conversation with how tell right, tell left, and center, and how this will help all of them. But I see here we only concentrated on the tell left, and we did not concentrate on the right again. When are we going to get to a point where we concentrate on all of these different groups of students?
We actually did. This is just an example. So let's go through this example, then I'm going to let Vicki discuss that, because when I went into her office, in each office, the principals also show what they were doing for tell right, centered, and other students. So this is just the example we're using at this point. I think what's significant about this is now we know that whatever interventions we're using in these scenarios, which are the tail left and slight tail left, in scenarios 11, 12, 16, and 17, that were used at Cypress worked. Now, they didn't work for all kids. We still have a second round of testing in math and in reading, but going from 2 out of 6 passing to 5 out of 6 passing is a significant increase. Going from 2 out of 7 passing in reading to 5 out of 7 passing this year is significant. The tell right kids we also have to do interventions for, because if you don't continue to excel, as Matt said earlier, with the tell right students, their scores will drop, but if they are particularly in the top right portion of the grid that is given by INOVA, which is greens and blues. Greens are going to, generally across the state, about 95% of the students that are green pass. And our district is about 98% because we have a little higher passing rate than the state. Blues are usually around 85%. We're hoping to hit about 90%. So if you don't do that, you'll see those scores go down. So Vicki did, and not just at Cypress, but all the schools, look at the tail rights as well.
But there's, maybe I'm just misunderstanding the concept a bit, or maybe it's just the example. That's why this example is awesome. I had thought of tail left as any student underperforming where we would expect them to be. Therefore, I would think a lot of tail left students are still already passing and, you know, maybe even commended. I mean, it's all relative where they want. And yet this example is all about whether or not they passed or not. Is that just because it so happened that all the tail left here? Because again, I assume the tail left includes kids that pass it and maybe even... Because
you're looking at grays and yellows.
Yes.
If you look at the color schema, a tail left green is more than likely going to pass the test, because about 95% of the greens pass. But if the tail left green, they've underperformed. When you get down to red, it's about 15% of the kids in the red category pass. So tail left reds are kids that are really underperforming, even though there's only 15% of the kids that are categorized as red, they have a much less likely chance to pass. So
color coding then is, it's not, so these are all tail left. The color coding then is likelihood to pass as well. So we basically did two things. We went tail left and
color coded
likelihood to pass, but there are some tail left kids here who are likely to pass, but they're still tail left to, like, to Pam's point. We still gonna, okay, sorry.
The green scenario 1, just look at that chart that's up there, you can see green scenario 1. Again, remember, about 90 to 95% of the kids, depending on which district you're in that does this process, those kids are going to pass. But they're underperforming relative to where they can perform when you look at students who score similar and have similar kinds of backgrounds and instruction, and that's what Ameris groups them together in. So it's both. It's color coded
in this example.
This is just one example. Yes.
Thank you.
And actually, I didn't do a good job of explaining that, because the students that we were looking at are the students that are in that box there on the screen in the gray and yellow. So they're at the lower performing of that. So they're not the ones that, for the most part, did pass. They are the ones that didn't pass. previously.
Got it.
Yep.
And just so I understand sample size, when we look at 5 of 6 or 2 of 6 for math, we're talking about 6 students. That's the
Correct.
sample size for this particular cohort or group.
Correct.
And similarly for reading, right? Because we're talking about 5th grade.
That's correct.
Of the 5th graders at Cypress, about 7 of them fell into this tail left gray yellow box.
That's correct.
Okay.
What I'll say on this too, one of the things that's been a really nice addition for us is going through this process is when you start to break things down and you take a look at the students that fall into these categories, you start to realize that it's very manageable numbers. And all of a sudden you have an idea based on statistics of what you can do with that small group of students, and it allows you an action plan. I do think sometimes in the past, being in other districts and being here, you get a score back and you say, well, all right, now what do I do between first and second administration? Or what do I do between now and next year? How do I do it? This actually breaks it down into small, manageable numbers with some support behind it so we can move the needle forward.
And Vicki, the power of this next year will be, we'll take Cypress, and we'll take Nauman, and we'll take about 5 elementary schools and put them together. The principals will come in and talk about their interventions in front of other principals, which ones work really well in certain scenarios. It gives an opportunity for us to look across the district, particularly as we group elementaries together, middle schools and high schools. One of the interesting things about this that I found more fascinating was one of the schools performing at a very high level, having a lot of tell rights, was Henry Middle School in a lot of categories. But Henry Middle School didn't always have the highest test performance if you just look at pass-fail. They did well, very well, but they were moving a lot of kids relative to other middle schools in the district, outperforming them in the same categories. Because it's not always based on pass-fail, because they have a lot of kids, and sometimes I should say, not a lot, they have kids in red, yellow, and gray that are not predicted to pass, but if they keep performing at a high level, by the time they get out to high school at Vista Ridge, they're going to do very well. So that's why it's important to look at not only at the tail left, center, and tail right, but the color that they're coded into as well, because if students continue to do well and they're yellow, they'll move up to gray in a feature. And then they'll go up to blue because the probability of them passing increases. Success breeds success. And eventually, in high school, they can be green. But I think Pam's point is a really important one. It's kids from all walks, from all backgrounds, that get examined in the system. It's not just the students that are failing, it's also students that are passing, the students that are underperforming, outperforming. Because they're outperforming, you want to know what do we do with them? Because there's a statistical analysis called regression towards the mean that we all learned about in our programs studying stat, and that means that what will happen naturally is they'll go back to the average. So if they're outperforming and we don't continue with those interventions, they're going to go right back to where they were. And that's why measuring interventions is saying, okay, what interventions really worked at Cypress? What really worked at Reed? What really worked at Nauman in the Cedar Park area was similar students? Let's make sure we do those intervention programs. What programs are we doing that aren't working? And I can tell you, as a principal who used this for many years, I went from a school with over 60 intervention strategies to less than 20, it was closer to 15, and increased performance. Because you just keep adding interventions, as Matt said, without really studying, do those interventions make a difference? So, Vicki, I'm sorry if you can go on.
What's a data-driven campus improvement plan driver?
Yeah. So then same thing with reading. We had 5 out of 7 just this particular group, and we had students in every one of these categories that I could talk about. I just happened to pick a particular section to bring to you tonight. And in that section we had 7 students that we were particularly focused on. And the reason that I brought those was because it encompassed both of those areas. And I wanted to talk about the academic, but I also wanted to talk about the psychosocial piece and that mentoring piece, because I think that's so important with everything that's going on with our students now, that we're starting to recognize that we need to bring a lot of those pieces in for our students. And so we did have 5 of the 7 that did significantly well this go around, and we're very, very proud of them. Only 2 of the 7 had passed previously. And so we're very proud of the progress and growth that they made.
Did the other colors show similar type of growth?
Yes, we had very, very, very good growth. So very pleased with our results. What we did learn from, and I'll switch to the next slide, what we did learn from this is that from the INOVA data, what we basically came away with it with is how do we early intervene for our students, and what did we learn from the INOVA data that we can take to our other grade levels and that we can apply for our students for making classes for next year and assigning them to classroom teachers for next year, making sure that we get their placements right, those type of things. So what we did was I took, and the key areas for INOVA were intervening academically, right, for small amounts of support, academic support, to larger amounts of academic support, having that academic support with that psychosocial component with it, having strictly psychosocial support without the academic support, and then having considering challenge, where they didn't need that psychosocial support or they didn't need the academic support, but they needed that challenge, and that's kind of what you were talking about, Ms. Wagner. And then something completely different, if they needed something completely different. And so we took those 6 different categories down to our teachers in 2nd and 3rd grade, and took our students that were in those classes and separated them out into those different categories, so that, like Matt was talking about, we could make the class and understand the class from a perspective of making it manageable. This is the group of students that I need to intervene with heavy during this time of the day, and this is the group of kids that I need to have the counselor working with during this time of the day, so that it became a more manageable chunk and we knew how to break it down and intervene in a more effective manner, and intervene early so that we could intervene at the 2nd and 3rd grade level and not wait until they were 4th and 5th graders to be intervening for test anxiety and getting that psychosocial intervention that we needed to get in place for them.
So this is a question I asked Dr. Troxel, and he said, just wait, she's going to be here. So now I get to ask you, because I was concerned. I was like, well, if STAR is going to be the one we're using now as our go-to, how will it help the students in our system who aren't? Right? And so this looks like you have been able to implement it in 2nd grade. So even if we don't have a STAR, you still have something in place where you're able to use it.
Correct.
And if I could say this right, just correct me if I'm wrong, but if I try to sum this up, what I'm hearing is what we have is a system that doesn't tell us how we can have better test takers. The system that we're looking at is it's a tool or a resource where whatever test or whatever benchmarks or whatever metrics we use, within some parameters, of course, but given that, that's actually, we're using it as a tool to help us figure out what type of academic intervention, what type of academic growth and learning can take place for the student in a year. So it's not so much about the passing or the increase in test, although that's our mark that we're using. This is a tool that's showing us the different interventions that can take place. Am I summing that up?
Yes, but it's not just academic. Yes.
I think
And that's a great point as well.
this is where I want to brag on Vicki for a second, because honestly, and I think I can brag on a lot of our principals because of this. If you walk into Vicki's office now, her office is walls of data. And I don't know if we can all say that that's been true in the past, but you go into her office and basically she's taken down and owned it as a principal and has the students listed in her office, knows them by group, knows them by grade level, knows them by what we need to do to ensure that they are growing. Even at the 2nd and 3rd grade where we don't have STAR data for them. And one of the things that when I was in there, she, I think very eloquently said, she said, they were talking about it with their teachers, and their teachers said, well, we can do that for our 2nd and 3rd graders too. And then they start taking a look at things, and some of the processes that we've put in place using the STAR data, we can translate to the lower grades. If you play that out for a couple of years, now we have targeted interventions and supports at these lower grades as well that can ensure that their success is moving forward at the higher grades in the testing.
How does the plan roll out through the whole district? Where does it stand?
So right now, I'll go ahead and let Vicki finish up, and I'll come back to that, okay?
All right.
Sorry, we keep jumping in on Vicky, it's my
What's
bad.
that? You were trying to get it done.
And that's pretty much the end of what I had to say, just that we're using this information, we now have all of this information, and we'll be now using this information as we plan for next year, and place these kids into the proper classroom with the proper teacher for intervention, because we know what they need from day one. We have the information at our fingertips, and we can start from day one intervening and making a difference for them from day one. So I'm very pleased with the information that we have and being able to use that information effectively.
Something that I missed, I'm sorry, something that I missed is, how do we initially put them in a color?
INOVA put them in a color, so
Based on,
So that's based on their STAR scores. So they go through statistical analysis of the student's performance and compared to the like peers in our district, and they basically put them in color groups, those colors that we projected before, and then on the bell curve in order to say these students fall into these specific categories, and that helps us target the interventions.
Jim, and for all of you, what's difficult about this is Dr. Ramirez does a 2-day training. It's about 7 to 8 hours per day, and then does follow-ups, and we're trying to condense it into about 45 minutes. But if we ever want to just have Dr. Ramirez come and talk, or if you ever, we could invite you all, because some of you have sat through some of his presentations, invite you all when he comes up, because we're going to have to get our new teachers trained on this, and so we have either he or one of his consultants come up each year and train our new teachers on how to read this data. I'll make sure you all get invitations, because he talks about how he does the analysis. He's a very interesting gentleman because he has a doctorate in statistics, but he also has a doctorate in psychology. So he looks at the psychosocial aspect very heavily. And with a math degree, he can explain it much better than we can.
Yeah, because how does STAR do anything with the social aspect of it? So he's got other parameters in there, somewhere, other data points in there.
So one thing I'm still trying to understand is, I understand how the INOVA model works, and I understand that it requires a data input like a STAR test, right? How do we use the model where we don't have a STAR administration? What other data are we using to provide those color codes, right?
So as a central office, we worked with them, I'll merge this with Donnie's question a little bit before too. So we started this process back in November and started getting our administrators trained at that time. And one of the things that they brought to us at that time was the ability to merge some of this with our current district assessments. And what we've been going through the curriculum management audit and the assessment task force that Dr. Golden and I have talked to you about some, is really looking at those assessments to ensure we can use them in conjunction with this. We do have assessments that are used at the lower levels that we'll be able to use for the INOVA process, and we'll be able to include those in this analysis in the future.
Okay. We've talked some in the past, and I've been a proponent of other standardized tests as a potential data input. How important is that kind of an instrument, or is it not vary if we've got a good battery of internal assessments that we can use instead?
I think one of the key things that Vicki did well is talk about how they triangulate data, and I think that's an important piece, is that we know that STAR is one piece of data for our students, and our students are more than one piece of data. And so we take a look at many different things, and Vicki did an excellent job in taking a look at not only how they did on the STAR data and through the INOVA process, but the other assessments that we use as a system. Going to your question, I think that those assessments also play a role in this, and we should be able to say, based on our INOVA data and the student's profile, based on their PSAT data that we provide for them in the 8th grade, is this student underperforming, and what will we need to do to intervene? It gives us a more whole picture of each and every student, and I think that those pictures are valuable as we continue to move students forward.
So I hear you saying that PSAT data, as an example, is very valuable.
Absolutely.
Is there significant value in looking at maybe annual assessments of different types? I mean, there are a number of standardized tests out there that we could use. How valuable is that? In particular, I'm thinking about the frequency with which STAR is administered,
Right.
and the importance of using this kind of an approach in early grades, as opposed to waiting till middle school and high school when it's a lot harder to change outcomes.
I think you're speaking exactly to the purpose of our assessment task force that we've had in place since last year, and the real purpose behind all of that is to take a look at all the assessments we have in the system, find out, similar to what the audit went through, is are they any good? Are they being used? And are they helping us improve student performance? And what we found from some of those internal assessments is we've been doing them for some time. They weren't being used on a regular basis, so then therefore, how are they informing teachers to inform instruction? So we've got to retool some of those. I think what you'll see is an evolution of our assessment system. I wouldn't say because of INOVA, but in partnership with INOVA and a statistical analysis of this process, of the STAR data, so that we can better serve each and every one of our students. So I think it's going to be a process that we'll have to do, and it'll kind of be a three-pronged approach between STAR and items like PSAT and internal assessments.
Madam,
Let me put it this way, if you were to-
11th grade.
I'm sorry?
The assessments stop at the 11th grade.
Yeah, so when you get into high school, you're talking about the STAR, and of course, yes.
So tomorrow, if the state of Texas were to pass a bill and get it signed into law that there were no longer state mandated testing, we would still want to do this process.
I agree.
We would want to develop our own internal assessments, and that's one of the things that Matt's team is doing, so that we could actually measure whether or not students are making progress and growing. And again, going back to that analogy of the $20 to pass whatever test we would come up with internally, we just don't want students to come in with $30 or $40 worth of knowledge and go backwards every single year, but still be counted as a passer. That's what the beauty of this particular test and this particular assessment tool. So it's really not about, and it never was for me in my 20 years of being a principal now and a superintendent, about passing a test. If it's about passing a test, we're trying to measure the wrong thing. What it should be about is, are kids growing academically? Are they growing socially? Are they growing emotionally? So that when they exit our system, they're prepared for whatever they're going to do after they leave us, whether it's a college, military career, or some going off to trade and technical schools. So it's one of those very important measurements, and it's a different way of thinking about testing. Because when you go and listen to the legislature, which I know a number of us do in this room on a regular basis, they're talking about pass-fail. They're talking about giving a measurement of an A, B, C, F. I don't care about any of that. I've been asked by members of our legislative group, do I care about the A through F system? The answer is no. What I care about is growing kids, and if we're growing kids every year, we're going to score at the highest levels of that performance measurement. So it's important for us to keep that in mind. What's happened is the data has been used from testing, really it's been misapplied to education in such a manner that people no longer trust the data or want to have kids tested. But if we're using it for helping kids to grow, then it doesn't matter whether it's a STAR test or they eliminate it, we say we're going to do our own internal assessments.
Yeah, that's right. I think I see the test data as fuel for the system, used properly, right? It can be totally misused. And I guess the thrust of my questions is really to ensure that we have all the fuel that we need, right, to determine what is possible for each of our students, and that we are employing all of the appropriate interventions to help them accomplish what is possible for them where they are today, right? And I worry sometimes that maybe we don't have all of that fuel that we need that comes out of whatever flavors of assessments are available in a particular year. And so I guess I, for one, just wanted to voice my support for ensuring that we have that fuel on hand so that we can make that analysis every year for every student.
So Vicki, what surprised you? What surprised you about this process? Good and bad.
I think the ahas for me were that we were the teacher-student conversations that happened. I don't think those happened as much as they should have happened before. I think they brought things to light that maybe didn't happen at an elementary level prior to this happening before. I think it's allowed us to intervene for students at a much younger level than we ever have before for things such as test anxiety and things that get in their way that we haven't been able to intervene for before. So I'm very hopeful that we've caught things early and have been able to make a difference for them at this level that we can prevent things. We've taken a proactive stance that we didn't have before, that we were missing before, really, is what I think has come out of this. There are approaches that we weren't taking before. And I'm thrilled that we've been given the opportunity to kind of discover these things along the way.
Going back to Donnie's question about next steps for us, we'll continue to work with our principals, and as Dr. Troxel said, we'll continue to work with Dr. Ramirez and his staff to train our new staff and expand that training through the year. One thing that we mentioned, and I want to reiterate, is the focus on the intervention grids and the refinement of interventions. I think that starting at mid-year this year was a good step for us because it gives us a foundation for this next year. Principals are actually able to say, here are the things I tried in the spring, and here's what I think worked pretty well and what didn't work well. Now, as Vicki said, we have a foundation for next year. They're going in at the beginning of the year with this information and profiles of students and be able to say to those new teachers who have the new students in their class, here's where we are. Think about how rich that data conversation is for those teachers. And then finally, continuing to make sure that we have principal and team discussions with the schools. We've been out at many schools. Vicki obviously did an outstanding job. She made an impression on all of us in the way she had owned this process and really took ownership of her students' growth at her schools. I will say this, we've had a number of other schools that have done very well with it as well. Vicki is just one example of that, but we are extremely impressed with the way our principals and their teams have been owning this as well. I also want to make sure you all know Vicki did everything she was supposed to do to get the slides up there. That was entirely my fault, so blame that one on me.
We'll blame you.
Yes, I know.
Vicki, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah,
I
thank
really
you a lot.
appreciate
That's
it.
great.
Thank you.